George Stevens' masterpiece, A Place in the Sun, has endured the test of time and remains a model of film craftsmanship. But bringing Theodore Dreiser's classic novel, An American Tragedy, to the screen would prove to be a formidable task for Stevens. Yet Stevens believed that this story, with its universal themes, would be one to which audiences would relate. As the cameras began to roll in 1950, George Stevens was regarded as one of the film industry's most accomplished filmmakers. His son, producer George Stevens Jr., recalls his father.
My father was born in Oakland, California. His parents were actors, and he and his brother were raised in San Francisco. When I started to become conscious that my father was a director, I started to wonder where his talent came from. Why did he have these extraordinary instincts? Because he didn't finish school. His parents moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles to become movie actors, and he had to work to support himself, and he started a little photography business in Glendale, California, and then got a job as a cameraman, assistant cameraman, and went out on location and worked on a series of films called Rex, the King of Wild Horses. And my father became a fine cinematographer, and he went on to photograph almost all of the Laurel and Hardy comedies. He was both their cameraman and a gag writer, and he was doing that when he was 23 years old. In the 30s, my father made Alice Adams, Swing Time, Vivacious Lady, Gunga Din at RKO, and then moved over to Columbia Pictures, where he made The More the Merrier, The Talk of the Town, and Penny Serenade. And as he told me, one night in a screening room at Columbia Pictures, he ran a picture called Triumph of the Will, made by Leni Riefenstahl. It was a brilliant documentary glorifying Hitler and the Third Reich. The next day, he joined the Army, and he got a commission as a major. And he wanted to go overseas. He was 36 years old, and General Eisenhower put him in charge of a special coverage unit that was assigned to film D-Day and the landings at Normandy. He and a wonderful group, the playwright William Saroyan, Joe Byrock, who would later film It's a Wonderful Life, Ivan Moffat, the novelist Irwin Shaw, William Meller, who would film A Place in the Sun and Giant. He had this unit that was sometimes called the Stevens Irregulars.
I didn't meet George Stevens until after the infantry basic training was over, and so I became part of that outfit, and we were dealing with all the footage that the Americans and the British were shooting.
They went all through the war, all through Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, the link-up with the Russians at the Elbe, and notably the liberation of the concentration camp at Dachau. And they were the first troops in, and they filmed this horror of these emaciated, desperate people. And he came back from the war, and he brought that experience to filmmaking, and he made a different kind of film.
Finally, we all got back to Paris, after we'd been to Berlin and all that. He said, would I give him my address in California? I had my mother's address, and indeed telephone number. And he said, let's get together. I'd been offered a job at MGM as what's called a junior writer, and I sort of tentatively accepted it. And then George called me, and we met in Los Angeles. So he said, look, I'm forming Liberty Films, and would you like to be so-called associate producer? And so I did. And that kind of a job, so-called associate producer, as everybody knows, it can vary between writing a scene and producing coffee.
In his attempts to bring An American Tragedy to the screen, George Stevens met with considerable resistance from the studio.
Paramount had made the picture once before, and the idea of remaking this film was alien to the studio. In fact, my father had to sue the studio, and because he felt they were inhibiting, he was under contract, and they were inhibiting his ability to work by turning down all the projects that he wanted to make. And eventually, he basically forced them to make the picture.
Though I had seen the original American Tragedy, that wasn't in my mind. I'd read the book, and so had George, by the way. At what point he had read it, I don't know. But I was keen on the idea of doing it. And he was very keen on the idea of doing it, and we discussed the idea in rather general terms until it became much more concrete as a conception.
The Dreiser's novel touched him, and he saw a way to take that story, which was a story based on a true incident from the 1920s, and to translate it into a contemporary story taking place after the war, and changing it to the post-war sensibility, where a young man coming out of the army, the world was freer then, the stratas of society were less defined, and it was possible for the Montgomery Clift character to aspire to become part of the upper class. And I think, again, that theme of the outsider, the person reaching for the American dream, which in this case is wealth, a beautiful woman, and a better life.
Mr. Eastman was good enough to say that if I came through here, perhaps he might be able to find some place for me at the mills.
I think we can work something out along that line.
Another challenge facing Stevens was the casting process, and the risks he took were considerable. Stevens cast 29-year-old Montgomery Clift in the role of George Eastman.
Wow.
For the role of Angela Vickers, Stevens set his sights on 17-year-old actress Elizabeth Taylor. Taylor had been a staple of such MGM films as Lassie Come Home, National Velvet, and Little Women. It was her striking work in A Place in the Sun that would propel Taylor from family films to serious roles.
He had me come over to his office at the studio to meet Monty. And so we all met at the same time. And I was terrified of meeting him. I was so in awe of him. And he was putting Monty just as much ill at ease as I was. We were both scared witless. And George was like the puppeteer. He was playing us both off, watching, and seeing our reactions to each other. And I kind of twigged that after a while, and I think Monty did too. So we just relaxed and were ourselves with each other.
After their first meeting, Paramount arranged for Clift to take Elizabeth Taylor to the premiere of The Heiress. Although they had just recently met, the two got on famously.
We giggled our way through that, because Monty had never been in a tuxedo. And it was a funny night.
Do I make you nervous?
Yes.
You look like an Eastman. Are you one of them?
Mm-hmm. I'm a nephew. My name's George.
I'm Angela.
Vickers. I saw you here last spring.
I don't remember seeing you before.
I think one of the bold strokes in this film was the casting of Elizabeth Taylor. She had worked at MGM, and only at MGM, and my father chose her and arranged for her to come from MGM. She was 17 years old, and she was the most beautiful woman you can imagine.
Her performance was somewhat of a surprise, how good it was, how natural she was, how good her instincts were, her movements, her turns, her hesitations, all that. She wasn't coached particularly by George in doing all those things. He said what he wanted, and she was very quick to interpret. She was very clever.
Well, all my teachers, because I never had an acting lesson in my life, all my teachers were the people I acted with, that I was directed by. The experience of my life one-on-one with people on the set. And that was how I learned whatever was my technique. It was purely instinctive.
There's a quality in Elizabeth that I just find profoundly moving, and it was certainly the first step of hers as a serious actress, and she built on that over the years.
Seems like we always spend the best part of our time just saying goodbye.
A Place in the Sun was the first of 3 films Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift made together. It also marked the beginning of a lifelong friendship that would last until Clift's death in 1966 from a heart attack at age 45.
I will always love Monty. We got along as friends and then as actors. And for the first time in my life, I started to take acting seriously, because my leading men before had been dogs and horses. And this was my first leading man and my first real actor. I thought, wait a minute, what's he doing? What's he up to? And I started to listen and realized that it was more than just cut, make some lines you'd learned the night before, hit your mark, you know. But it was more than that it was something that could make this man shake from head to toe with emotion. And I thought, I've got to find out what it is inside him that moves him so completely, emotionally, that can get him to that state as George Eastman, not Montgomery Clift, to make the sweat literally come out on his body, to make his eyes actually fill with tears as George Eastman. And I thought, what is he doing? And I began to think about acting, and I would listen to George's direction on a totally different level than I had other directors, and began to understand the reasons they had for certain directions. And I think that's when I first began to act.
Oh, Angela, if I could only tell you how much I love you. If I could only tell you all.
Tell Mama. Tell Mama all.
The timing was particularly fortuitous for me, because I'd only received my real kiss in real life 2 weeks before. It would have been really embarrassing if my first kiss had been on screen, not in real life. Anyway, my kiss with Monty was much more exciting, and it just happened. There was no direction. I wasn't told what to do. I just did. I kissed him instinctively.
George Stevens had considered many actresses for the unglamorous role of the plain and ill-fated Alice. He made a surprising choice, offering the part to Shelley Winters. The role was a big departure for Winters, who had cultivated a sex symbol persona in her previous films. She recalls how she finally got George Stevens to consider her.
I was determined to get this role. So he agreed to see me at the Hollywood Athletic Club. And I was in a picture, something like east of Java or South Sea Center, I don't know what the name of it was. And I had platinum blonde hair, whereupon I had one day off, and I decided I didn't care. And that night I dyed my hair brown. I went to a factory and saw how the girls were dressed. And I took a sandwich in a brown paper bag, and I got there a little early. It was 5 o'clock I was supposed to meet him. And I got there early, and I sat over in the corner with 2 little bobby pins in the side of my hair, and I just sat there. And he came in, and he looked around and didn't see me, and he sat down and picked up a copy of Life magazine. And then he looked at his watch and kept looking around. And I kept my shoes nailed to the floor. I said, this is the only way I'm going to get a test. And then finally he got sort of annoyed and started leaving. Suddenly his head spun around and he saw me with that sort of bare walk. He came over and looked at me. He said, all right, if I test you and you get the part, will you let me photograph you this way? And I said, Mr. Stevens, if I get this part, you can photograph me anyway.
It was decided that this girl, this working class girl, this victim, should be a kind of a vulnerable creature. That seemed to be a given. And then George surprised me suddenly by saying, how about Shelley Winters? And I thought, well, that's pretty odd, because Shelley Winters was a sort of a glamour girl. Anyway, George had the idea that side could be peeled away, and underneath would be a more ordinary-looking and somewhat tougher Shelley.
You lied to me, George, for the last time. And now I want you to come and get me.
It's not going to be too easy right now.
Now.
I'll do it tomorrow morning.
I said now!
Stephen's attention to detail is evident throughout the film, and his cameraman's eye was crucial to telling the story.
So often the camera is an observer. There are scenes where the camera may just sit back and a long scene plays, never cutting. And then there will be another scene where there are tremendous juxtaposition of images. And for the first time, there are these long overlapping dissolves where one scene continues under another, and another begins under that one and continues. And it was a way of juxtaposing the life of Elizabeth Taylor's side of the picture, the wealthy family, and the Alice Tripp side, the Shelley Winters character, who is poor. And in so many cases, these contrasting images are a very forceful kind of storytelling.
One of the film's pivotal scenes takes place in the rowboat on the lake just prior to Alice's drowning. Winters recalls her reluctance in shooting that scene.
Monty and I had both agreed that we weren't going to do it, that it was a bottomless lake in Lake Tahoe, it was November, it was cold, and that the stunt people could do it. And he had agreed. He was a big star already, and we had discussed it. And then one morning we come out, and there is this rowboat all wired. And they put grease on our bodies and rubber suits under our clothes and everything. And I'm looking at George, and I get in the rowboat, and I look at Monty, and he's sitting sort of like that. And George says, what's the matter, Shelley? I said, well, we agreed that we weren't going to do this. It's too dangerous. We could get hit in the head with an oar. And he said, Shelley, the oars are wired. We're pulling them away. You're a very good swimmer. When the boat turns over, you go down, you come up, and you say, George, help me. Then go down again. Say, please, God, help me. Go down. And again, come up. Well, anyway, on the third time that you go down, you swim out of camera range, just over here. And I look at him like that. And he said, it's simple. And he jumps off the raft. The camera and an ambulance and I don't know, air and everything's on this raft. He jumps with a Stetson and boots and a heavy coat, swims around the raft, gets on again and says, never mind the dialogue, we'll dub it in later.
The costumes in A Place in the Sun were designed by Edith Head. The white evening gown she created for Elizabeth Taylor sparked a fashion trend with women throughout the country, and the film started a lasting friendship between the actress and the designer.
She was wonderful. She became like my surrogate mother. And for years afterwards, I had a room at her house, and it had a little plaque at the bottom of the stairs. Elizabeth Taylor sleeps here. And sometimes when I'd be just sort of buzzing through, rather than stay at a hotel, or if I were alone, I'd stay with Edith and Bill.
Despite the seriousness of the film and its bleak resolution, A Place in the Sun opened in 1951 to huge audience appeal. Reviewers hailed it as one of the best motion pictures ever made. The Motion Picture Academy honored it with 6 Oscars: Best Director for George Stevens, Edith Head for Costume Design, Cinematographer William Mellor, Composer Franz Waxman, Editor William Hornbeck, and to Harry Brown for Best Screenplay, who shared the award with Michael Wilson.
I think we thought we'd made a very, very good film. How it would be received, of course, we didn't know. We thought we'd made a film that came up to all of our expectations.
Making it was a joy. From scene to scene, all the people around it, Ivan Moffat and Monty and Elizabeth.
I was the pet, and I could get away with murder.
I guess I was 18, and we went to the Academy Awards. My father was driving the car, a comment in itself, I think. And my mother and my grandmother were in the back seat. And I remember coming home after, I think Place in the Sun won 6 or 7 Oscars, and one of which was for him as director. And we were riding home, and the Oscar was on the seat between us. And I was young and very excited, and I think in his eyes I was a little too excited, because he looked over at me and smiled and said, "You know," he said, "we'll have a better idea of what kind of a picture this is in about 25 years.
Named by the American Film Institute as one of the top 100 motion pictures ever made, the film has earned its own place in the sun.
Every time you leave me for a minute, it's like goodbye. I like to believe it means you can't live without me.